You're listening to Life of the Record, classic albums told by the people who made them. My name is Dan Nordheim. Before I start the show, I wanted to tell you about another podcast you might like, especially since you're listening to this one. It's called One Song, and it was named one of the best podcasts by The Atlantic. It's hosted by friends Diallo Riddle and Luxury. Diallo is an actor, writer, director, and DJ, and Luxury is a producer, DJ, songwriter, and musicologist. On each episode, they bring thoughtful and humorous perspectives as they break down the stems and stories behind iconic songs across genres, and tell you why they deserve one more listen. They've also had award-winning musicians such as Questlove, Warren G., and Jimmy Jam join them in their conversations. Recently, I listened to their Led Zeppelin episode about Whole Lotta Love, which broke down the history of the song in detail, and I have to tell you, it changed how I hear the song. You can find a link to the podcast in the show notes of this episode, or just search for One Song on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Titus Andronicus formed in Glen Rock, New Jersey in 2005 by Patrick Stickles. The band lineup coalesced around Stickles, Liam Betson, Dan Tews, Ian Graetzer, and Ian Dykstra by the time they made their first album. The local label, Troubleman Unlimited, agreed to put out their full-length debut. The Airing of Grievances was released in 2008 and was an unexpected success. XL Recordings became interested in signing the band, and they agreed to re-release the first album in 2009. Around this time, Eric Harm took over on drums, while Stickles moved to Somerville, Massachusetts, and began writing songs that would make up their next record. The Monitor was eventually released in 2010. In this episode, for the 15th anniversary, Patrick Stickles reflects on how the album came together. This is the making of The Monitor.
Hey, this is Patrick Stickles of the rock band Titus Andronicus, and I'm here on the Life of the Record podcast talking about our second album, The Monitor. For those 30 days, that studio, that barn in New Paltz, New York, was where I lived, and I didn't really leave the building at all for that entire month of August 2009. I was just living and breathing it and just really in the thick of it. And in the movie, you'll see that I look like a completely disgusting hobo, like more than I even usually did at that time. God knows if I even had like a fucking toothbrush, but I certainly wasn't, bathing every day or maybe even every week. I probably was stinking that whole place up. But I was just, in my mind, that was just my level of dedication. I had total tunnel vision, just complete eyes on the prize. Nothing else mattered. What am I going to leave the studio for? To go to eat at some restaurant? No. What's that got to do with anything? I'm trying to make the greatest rock album of my generation.
From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic giant step the earth and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or set a track on the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher. As a nation, free men, we will live forever or die by suicide.
All right, so to begin at the very beginning, I founded the band Titus Andronicus in the year 2005. I was 19 years old, and I was just wrapping up my freshman year of college in New Jersey, where I'm from. And in the years leading up to that, I had a band that I'd founded and maintained all through high school, which eventually coalesced around myself and two other guys, one of whom was Andrew Cedarmark, and the other one was a guy named Martin Courtney, who a lot of your listeners might know as the founder and leader of the band Real Estate. So I went to high school with these guys, and we'd had this band, and when we graduated, we all ended up going to college in New Jersey. Eventually, the other two guys decided they weren't really digging the whole New Jersey college thing anymore, and they transferred to colleges out of state. So I was kind of left behind in New Jersey without a band. I decided that I was going to start a new band and that it would be a band that no one could take from me, a band that would be over when I decided it was over. And so therefore I would be the guy who wrote all the songs for this band, and I would also sing the songs, and I would have a more flexible approach to maintaining the band personnel. And that band became Titus Andronicus. And all through my college years, like I said, it was just kind of a way to keep the party going from high school. And the band was mostly people that I'd known in high school who were either still living in Glen Rock, New Jersey, where I'm from, or people that had been from Glen Rock and were going to school in New York City, such as the bass player Ian Graetzer. But it was just kind of a fun thing for the weekend, and it was just an extension of the sort of hobby that rock and roll had been in high school. Even though we had recorded an EP, a CDR of 5 songs, and we were playing around the city, playing at places like Cake Shop and Chenet and all these different, Lower East Side type spots. And so this sort of all, culminated in the summer of 2007. We made our first album, which was called The Airing of Grievances. And that was never meant to be like a big deal. It was more so a document of where we were at that time, where I was at with my songwriting or whatever. And it was going to be the sort of thing that probably not many people would hear. Ian Graetzer worked as kind of like an intern, but sort of just like an assistant to a record company out of Bayonne, New Jersey called Troubleman Unlimited, which was run by a guy named Mike Simonetti. And he had been really impressed that we had gotten a 7-inch out. We put out one 7-inch on a label out of Portland called Shake Appeal Records. And we had used that as an impetus to go out on this little tour that we did that was 10 days long, where we basically drove to Chicago and back and played along the way. And he thought that was very impressive initiative for young guys like us to take. So he cut us a very cute little check so that we would have a little budget to go and record an album, which he would put out on Troubleman Unlimited. And that's exactly what we did. And that record, which was called The Airing of Grievances, like I said, came out on Troubleman Unlimited in April of 2008, which is when Ian Graetzer and myself were both about to graduate from college. And I had this whole plan that I was going to go to graduate school to study to become an English teacher, which was the career path that I was on. And I'd already gotten into almost every graduate school that I applied to, and very fancy ones, I might add, at the risk of sounding immodest. So I was on a pretty nice career path for a guy like me as far as, pursuing my higher education with an eye towards having a regular, real job and a career when it was over. But then unexpectedly, the record that we put out became something of a smash hit, runaway success. We had gotten some rather good notices in the music press, particularly Pitchfork Media, which was a very, very influential site in those days. And all of a sudden, this band enterprise that had been just kind of like a fun thing started to look like it maybe was going to have more legs than we had thought or intended. And so Ian Graetzer and myself and the drummer that we had at that time, Eric Harm, we kind of decided that we should just give it a shot because we had the opportunity to do so. We'd gotten a booking agent. There was an awareness about this band that would enable us to tour the country like a lot more seriously. We were getting more and more offers to come and play all sorts of different places. And we were just like, well, whatever, like we're young. We might as well just do it. And I said to myself, you know what, fuck going to graduate school. Like, this kind of sounds like lame and annoying anyway. So that was exactly what we did. And for the next year, we just traveled all over America and indeed the world and sort of cut our teeth and, became a little more experienced and seasoned and grew as musicians a little bit, not too much, obviously, but got to be just a little bit more of a professional organization. And we bought a Chevy Express 3500 15-passenger van, and we would throw the amplifiers and the drums in the back of that van, and we would just drive to get any place that would have us.
There'll be no more counting the cars on the Garden State Parkway. No waiting for the fun walk bus to carry me to who knows where. And when I stand tonight near the lights of the Fenway, when I nod you like hell for the glory of the Newark Bears. 'Cause where I'm going to now, no one can ever hurt me. When the well of human hatred is shallow and dry.
So at the same time that all this is going on, that the first Titus Andronicus record is blowing up and everybody's loving it, and we're starting to get out on the road and take ourselves seriously, I also have this girlfriend with whom I've been, long distance for like a couple of years. I had known her in high school as well, but she moved up to Boston to go to one of those fancy schools that they got there. And on and off, we had tried to make the relationship work with the long distance thing. And I would often go drive up there, take the bus up there, the Funghua bus, to spend time with her and sort of just pursue our long-standing romance. And I was thinking about, going to graduate school up there myself because she had gotten some job in like a laboratory. She was like a scientist, a neurobiologist. And it was looking like I might go to grad school there. So we were like, well, this will be great because we've been dealing with this long distance for so long. And as everybody knows, long distance is the wrong distance. But of course, I scuttled the graduate school plans because rock stardom was calling me. So then I was like, well, we've given our booking agent the directive that we want to go out and work as hard as we possibly can and play every show that we get offered. So I'm not going to be around very much, so it doesn't really matter where I live exactly. Like, it's not that important if I live in New Jersey where the other guys in the band are, because it's not like we're even going to be rehearsing. We're just going to be playing shows anywhere that we possibly can. So the decision was made that I would move up to Boston so that when I did have time off the road, I could spend it with this girlfriend that I had. And so we found a place in Somerville, Massachusetts, and that was where we tried to see what we could do with a more grown-up version of our long-distance romance. At the same time that I made this move to Massachusetts, to Somerville, two other things were happening. One is that I had started to smoke a lot of weed, a lot of marijuana. because on the first Titus Andronicus tour of the full United States, I had never been to California before, as an adult anyway. And when we went out there and we were playing like the punk houses and like playing on like the Cali DIY scene, people were smoking a lot of weed. Like they just had a ton of weed out there. And like we would stay at people's houses and they'd be like, oh yeah, we have like a huge like marijuana farm in the backyard. And they would just hand us over like just this huge like amounts of weed like for free. So that was like the culture out there. And so we were just smoking weed all the time. And when I got back home, I was like, this weed smoking thing is like pretty cool. It's like really like kind of expanding my mind. So I would get into that. And this girlfriend that I had that I was living with, like I said, she had quite a real grown-up job at that laboratory. So she would go to bed at a regular hour and I would stay up late and smoke this pot that I'd gotten so interested in. And at the same time that I was staying up late by myself and smoking all this pot, I found out about a documentary film by a guy named Ken Burns called The Civil War. And it was a very aptly, descriptively named movie because it was about the American Civil War. And this was like a 9, 10, or 11-hour documentary. And I guess maybe I acquired the DVD box set or something somehow. And I would stay up late, high as a kite and watch this movie and just be completely astounded, not only by what a cinematic triumph it was, but the way that it illuminated, these things from American history that, we're taught in school sometimes, but take for granted quite a bit and don't really think about. So much of the things we learn in school, we absorb it for a little while and then we kind of just forget it if we ever absorbed it at all. So I hadn't retained like any of my knowledge of that period of history, but watching this film and hearing, the beautiful words of Abraham Lincoln brought to life on the screen, and just the way that Mr. Burns laid out the series of conflicts and divisions that resulted in that catastrophe that, nearly ruined and ended our young nation is just like really wild and eye-opening for like a young guy who's, stepping out into the adult world for the first time and also smoking a lot of pot and getting high a lot.
Oh, I never wanted to change the world, but I'm looking for a New Jersey. 'Cause tramps like us, baby, we were born to die.
So like I said, the first Titus Andronicus record came out on a label out of Bayonne, New Jersey called Troubleman Unlimited, which was run by this guy, Mike Simonetti. And Mike had a relationship with this guy in England whose name was Chris Casa. And Chris worked for a record company called Merok, M-E-R-O-K. And Merok at the time was a subsidiary of XL Recordings, which was a British record company that initially got to be a big deal when they released The Prodigy and the Prodigy album Fat of the Land that had Firestarter. So Chris Casa was able to convince his bosses to get invested in this Titus Andronicus record and release it in England because Troubleman Unlimited didn't really have international distribution like that. And at the same time, in America, the American branch of XL Recordings was run by a guy named Chris Chen. And at the time, Chris Chen had a lot of clout within the company because he was the guy that signed Vampire Weekend and sort of oversaw and kind of helped to design their meteoric rise to the top of the indie rock pantheon at that time. As all your listeners are going to remember that in 2008, Vampire Weekend was like the biggest thing in the world as far as a lot of people were concerned. Chris Chen, however, had something of a secret punk rock past. And he grew up in Texas, and he had seen Fugazi live 14 times. That was a statistic that he used to like to cite. And I guess he decided that one of the ways he wanted to spend the clout and the capital that he had at XL was to sign a band that was a little bit more of a proper punk rock band, which I guess Titus Andronicus was, certainly more so than Vampire Weekend. Nothing against them. You know, they were the A-punk band, but they were not a punk band, if you know what I mean. And through some careful negotiation and wheeling and dealing on the part of our attorney, Matthew Kaplan, it was decided that we would be signed to Me Rock in the UK, and they would re-release the first album over there, and we would be signed to the primary American branch of XL in the United States under Chris Chen. And that was how we ended up being label mates with Adele. You know, now we're signed to XL. There's a big advance on the way. There is an audience for this music that this band is making. There is an appetite of some sort and a market for my songwriting. I want to do something important, or at the very least, do something important to me. I want to take full advantage of the opportunity that I have. I recognize that this opportunity is very possibly going to be very short-lived. I have the means and the resources and the budget to attempt to make a grand statement and to make the ultimate rock and roll album and to create like a generational masterpiece. Or this is what's going on in my pot-addled brain at the time anyway. Because the other movie that I'm watching is the Bruce Springsteen documentary Wings for Wheels, which is about the making of his album Born to Run. And I'm watching this movie and I'm seeing that Bruce Springsteen, who seems like such an untouchable rock deity now, really had his back up against the wall in like 1974 because his first two albums hadn't done very well. And the record company was maybe losing patience with him, and he wasn't maybe turning out to be the sure thing that certain people thought he was at one time. But he has an opportunity to make at least one more record, his third record, and he decides that if this is the last chance that he has to make a record, that he's going to leave it all on the table, and he's going to just really go for it. And whether or not he has the talent to do so, he's going to attempt to achieve greatness and make the ultimate rock and roll album and his dream of what the perfect rock album would be with the means and resources and the skill set that he had at that time. And I'm watching that and I'm thinking, well, that sounds like a great idea. Like, I didn't reckon that it was whatever record I was about to make was going to put me on the cover of Time and Newsweek like it did for Bruce Springsteen, but I liked the idea of taking a big swing. And I liked the humility of Bruce Springsteen, who will admit that he is not some kind of supernaturally talented musician with these like special God-given abilities that just make him like a natural virtuoso genius in the way that maybe like a Paul McCartney or somebody we might think of. Bruce Springsteen was a guy who had a lot of guts, and he was a guy that really liked to work hard, and he was a guy that liked to squeeze what talent he had for everything it was possibly worth. And he believed that whatever level of talent he was given by God or whoever else, that was not necessarily the deciding factor in whether or not he could achieve greatness or make the perfect rock album. Because as we know, rock music is not really about being talented or making something that's actually perfect. It's about personality and heart and grit and guts. And that counts for a lot more than if you can sing like an angel or pull like these unforgettable, pristine melodies out of your ass anytime you want. So between watching that Bruce Springsteen documentary and watching the Ken Burns documentary and smoking all the pot and moving up to Massachusetts and getting out on the road with the band and signing this big record deal, all these factors going on in my life pointed me towards the record that I felt like I wanted to make.
I'm doing 17, I'm doing 80 over 84. When I never let the mirror parkway magnetize me no more. Give me a brutal Somerville summer. Give me a cruel New England winter. Give me the great barbarian so I can see him turn into splinters. Cause if I come in on a donkey, let me go out on a gurney. I won't realize too late I never should have left New Jersey.
A More Perfect Union, the opening track on the album and the song that made me famous and the song that they'll put on my tombstone. A More Perfect Union is a song about driving. And it's a song about driving towards something, but also very much about driving away from something, driving away from a past, driving away from an environment that you didn't choose, an upbringing that maybe didn't suit you, and driving towards some kind of imagined future or towards some kind of promised land where you're going to have a new life and a lot more agency and the ability to become the person that you believe yourself to be and be a lot more autonomous in the process of becoming that person rather than just living on the same straight line that you've been expected to, where you'll just replace the people that came before you only to be replaced yourself when it's your turn and just be grist for the mill. And it's about the feeling of being in the car and tearing up the highway and imagining that there's like a big wide open world in front of you that's yours for the taking. And this is, one of the great themes in rock music. Roadrunner by the Modern Lovers could be the perfect example. Bruce Springsteen, Thunder Road would be another one. There's a million of them. It's one of the most classic archetypes for a rock song. And this, A More Perfect Union, was my entry to that canon. And not unlike Thunder Road on the Born to Run album, it is the opening of our story. And our narrator is escaping from somewhere. In his mind, he's on to bigger and better things and new adventures and just a much more wide open world. And it describes very much what my life was like at that time, both in terms of being on the road with the rock band, but also commuting back and forth from New Jersey to Boston, which is something I'd done a lot over the previous few years because of that girlfriend I mentioned. So there was a lot of time in the car driving between Boston and New York and back and forth and driving on all those highways I mentioned, New Jersey Route 17, Interstate 80, Interstate 84, the Merritt Parkway, all these different arteries that connected these metro areas. I'm singing about that part of my life, that routine, and this is also where I wrote the song, is in the car. Like, the thing that I'm singing about is actually happening to me as I'm writing it. And this was how a lot of the songs on the record came together, is just me on these long drives, because I didn't have a CD player in the car or anything, maybe like cassette player, but going places where I don't know the radio stations, and just kind of having these ideas in my head that I'm trying to expand on and to create a record. I'm driving and I just, think of the lyrics and I just come up with these ideas and kind of just sing them to myself. This was before smartphones and everything. So many times I would have to, pull over either on, the gas station or even just on the side of the road and look around the car for like a piece of paper or like some cardboard or something and try and find like a pen or a Sharpie marker and write these lyrics down before I forgot them. So at many of the ends of these drives, I would have, the songs that would become this record. And A More Perfect Union is one of those songs. I should also say it's divided into two parts. There's the first half of the song, which is more like regular rock, which is the very hopeful and optimistic part. It's just about the most hopeful, optimistic piece of music in my entire catalog. And then there is the second half of it, which is like kind of the more Irish sounding part, which is when our narrator, our hero, discovers that the new world which he's entering is actually not that different from the previous one. And the forces by which he was beset in his old life are still present and still ready to do their wicked work. And this change of scenery, this change of lifestyle has not actually solved his problems internally or externally. And that is kind of the beginning of our story. A More Perfect Union pretty much was always going to be the opening track in like the schematic of the album. And here's a tip for any young artists out there. If you have an album to write, it can be useful early on in the process to decide what the themes and the motifs and what the larger story of the album is going to be. If you're the sort of person that likes these kinds of concept albums and rock operas and stuff, that can be very useful because when you have those themes in place and you basically know what it is that you want to talk about, it eliminates a lot of the guesswork. And it takes away a lot of the terror of the empty page, because sometimes when you sit down to write a song or to create any piece of art, you can become paralyzed by how many options there are out there as far as things to discuss or subject matters to explore. So if early on in the process, you decide what it is that you want to talk about, like, in my case, I want to do this whole Civil War thing, that makes it a lot easier to just kind of put one foot in front of the other during the process. So in the case of A More Perfect Union, I was like, well, look at me. I got this kind of like upbeat, heraldic, sort of anthemic bunch of riffs and melodies here. This is like, could be pretty exciting as like an opening track. Why don't I just go ahead and see if I can come up with some lyrics that will be like a good introduction to the little story that I'm trying to tell, which to me was a lot easier than if I would have just said, oh, well, I can write about anything in the world. I can't decide, so I'm going to just write nothing, which is a trap that, that artists can fall into sometimes, but it didn't get me that time. So as I'm watching this film, and the film is explaining how America got itself in such a tight spot, and how these two opposing camps within the American government and the American culture just couldn't quite get on the same page. It seemed very familiar, and it seemed very modern and contemporary to me, as far as the things that I'd been observing in my young adulthood from the George W. Bush years. And this was the very beginning of the Obama era when I was watching this film. And it seemed to me that the problems that had been the impetus for the American Civil War of the 1860s hadn't really been resolved, and that the issues and the problems explained in the film were very much the issues that we as a country were facing at that time. And indeed, we seem to be facing still today. At the same time, I've also become aware of a concept in postmodernism, whatever that is, that certain people have a tendency to define themselves by an absence. To put it another way, they frame their own identity in the negative. Rather than saying, I'm X, they say, I'm not Y. More and more, I started to think that a lot of people that had really loud voices and really strong opinions about things maybe weren't defining themselves or their identity or their ideology in a positive way, but rather defining themselves negatively in opposition to something else. And feeling very strongly about that. And this was creating like what we would later, commonly call tribalism within America, like within our political system and within our culture, where we have a deeply polarized citizenry and electorate who are full of vitriol and hatred for the people that they perceive to be on the opposing team. And this hatred and this opposition that they have to the other side is more important to them than what their side actually believes or claims to believe. And these people seem to not care to think about, like, what do I want? What do I actually believe in? What do I think is right? And are far more concerned with whatever I perceive the other side to believe, I am simply going to believe the opposite of that. And this was a trend that I saw emerging, in the culture and in the media, and even in just, day-to-day interactions I would have with regular people. This was a trend that I found to be kind of alarming, but something that I was interested in exploring to the best of my marijuana-addled insomniac ability. So if you're going to talk about A More Perfect Union, the song, obviously we need to talk about the iconic opening monologue that opens the track and indeed the album. And this was a recitation performed by a really incredible man named Oki Canfield Chenoweth III. And Mr. Chenoweth was the drama teacher at Glen Rock High School in Glen Rock, New Jersey, where I'm from. and he was a serious local legend that had taught drama at the high school for like 30 or 40 years or something by the time that I became his student around the year 2000. And he had taught my older brother, and he had directed him as the lead in Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros, which was a very heady play, and it was really, a formative experience for me watching my brother perform this role when I was like 8 or 9, I guess. And I eventually became Mr. Chenoweth's student, and he was an incredible man, and he actually just passed away a few months ago. So I've thought about him, a little more than usual lately. But he was something else, and he is, a towering figure in my early life and taught me, some of the most valuable lessons in the arts. In just studying under him for just 2 years, he's had like as much of an impact on me as anybody else in my artistic development, and more than most. And his big thing was truthfulness. He really wanted you, when you got up on stage, like whatever you were going to say, the important thing was that the audience believed you, or rather, the audience believed, no matter how outlandish the thing that you were saying was, the audience would believe that you believed it. Like Mr. Chenoweth directed me in Hamlet, where I played the ghost of Hamlet's father. So I get up on stage and I say, I am your father's spirit. And like, obviously I'm not. I'm just a high school kid who's very much alive. But the point of his direction was often just trying to get us to deliver the lines with like the necessary conviction that the audience would think that you really believed what you were saying. That was like his main thing, because nobody wants to see a guy up on stage who like probably doesn't really mean whatever he's saying. Nobody wants to see that. Mr. Chenoweth's other big thing was raising the stakes. Whatever action you're doing on stage, whatever kind of situation you're in, if it's not working and if it's not coming across to the audience, then you would just raise the stakes, start behaving as though it's more important than it actually is. That could be something, like if the guy in the scene, like, can't find his pen or something, just for an example, like his direction would be like, act as though if you don't find the pen, you're going to die. Or like the world will explode if you don't find this pen. Like that's where he liked the stakes to be, on the stage and in the arts. And though I'm not an actor exactly, this idea of like trying to be truthful, or, presenting a version of truthfulness while also raising the stakes and ratcheting up the intensity, and just generally doing whatever you're doing with a lot of conviction and commitment to the bit are, values that I tried very deliberately to keep with me throughout my career in the arts. So that was Okie Chenoweth for you in a nutshell. And he was kind enough, when we were making the first Titus Andronicus record, he allowed me to come over to his house on Route 202 in Oakland, New Jersey, with my little 4-track cassette recorder. And he read for me a passage from The Stranger by Albert Camus, which was a, very important book to me at that time. And after the first record did so well, Mr. Chenoweth did such a fantastic job with that reading, I said, well, why don't we're taking everything about the first album up at least one notch. Maybe I should, get Mr. Chenoweth, give him an even larger role on the second record. And by that point, I'd kind of decided that we were going to go with this Civil War thing. And I've been watching the Ken Burns movie. And in the first episode of the Ken Burns movie, there is a reading or a recitation from Abraham Lincoln's address to the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum. I'm just watching episode 1 of the Civil War documentary, and all of a sudden, Sam Waterston, who we remember from Law and Order, he starts reading this speech. from whence shall we expect the approach of danger? But I'm listening to this speech and this incredible performance by Sam Waterston, and I'm just like completely gobsmacked. Like, this almost knocks me on the floor. Like, I couldn't believe that I'd never heard these words before. Like, I thought this was just the greatest string of words that anybody had ever put together. Like, the speech has become a lot more famous now, but at the time, I had never heard it before. And I was just like, holy guacamole, like, this is the best thing there is. And I'm gonna take this, because that was my attitude at the time, and I guess still is, that, anything that's out there in the air, and certainly in the public domain, I can use that for my own selfish purposes. So that's exactly what I did. And I went out and I got a book of Abraham Lincoln's writings and his speeches, and it had that address in it. And I brought it over to Mr. Chenoweth's house in Oakland, along with my little 4-track cassette recorder, just like I'd done for the first album. And I had him read that speech into the little microphone that I brought. And, the incredible actor that Mr. Chenoweth was, very talented guy with a lot of gravitas, and he delivered that monologue, really beautifully, and gave me like a really nice way to kick off this album. And I would like to say, I didn't realize it at the time, but I actually completely fucked myself when I did this. A lot of the times records have skits. Like, it was early on, that was very common in, hip hop, that they would have samples or like stuff from like movies, like Wu-Tang Clan, of course, was probably the best at this. They would fill up their albums with all these excerpts from all the old kung fu movies that they would watch as kids. And so you'd put in the Wu-Tang Clan CD and you'd be greeted by some dialogue from a kung fu movie and maybe like some, sound effects and stuff. And then one of RZA's incredible beats would drop and you would be off to the races. And that's like a great experience for the listener. And this practice, to give credit where it's due, in the indie rock world, this was normalized by Bright Eyes. All those early Bright Eyes albums usually would start off with like some kind of skit. And as a fan of those records at the time, I thought that was a cool thing. To me, it was a very effective way to start the listening experience. And plenty of other rock acts were doing it. It was like a thing in like pop punk and emo as well. So it was normalized within rock music. This tradition that, as far as I knew, it started in hip hop, was now fair game for rock. And so I said, well, look at me. Like, I got this great speech, these incredible words of Abraham Lincoln, recited beautifully by Mr. Chenoweth, who's such an important guy to me and so talented. And I've got this like certified banger, like this crazy heat rock of an opening track that's like, I don't know it yet, but everyone's going to say this is my best ever song. So like, what could be more perfect than this? And to have, when Mr. Chenoweth gets to that part about, as a nation of free men will live together or die by suicide, all that, guitar feedback and stuff that had been percolating in the background, busts in with that big driving rock beat from Eric Harmon, and we're off. Like, we really are like, blasting into hyperdrive at that point. And at the risk of sounding immodest, like, I think that what we achieved with that introduction was the absolute apotheosis of that whole idea of having like some kind of skit or monologue or spoken sampled thing bust into like a big, awesome song. Nobody has done it better than we did at that time, before or since, in my humble opinion. Like, we nailed it. Like, that was the perfect version of that idea, in my humble opinion. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was completely fucking myself in the long term. What you have to understand, when all these choices are being made, this is the year 2009, and there's no such thing as Spotify. There's no streaming. As far as we know, This album is going to be received by the audience as, a piece of vinyl or a compact disc, or worst case scenario, it's going to be an iTunes download. Okay? You can't just listen to it on a whim for free on the internet. I mean, you can, though. You can get it for free because you can download it on Napster or LimeWire or SoulSeek or whatever at the time. But as far as we knew, the listener's experience was going to be acquiring this album as a singular, cohesive piece of art, like a single object, one product. And it was going to be absorbed as such. People were going to get it, whether it was the CD, the vinyl, the download, whatever. And they were going to have it and they were going to put it on and they were going to listen to it. And I thought this whole spoken intro busting into this classic song was the perfect way to begin that experience for the listener. And everybody that's heard it agrees with me. Like, it is an awesome experience for people that had the experience that way. But when you look at the way that the music industry is now and the different way that music is consumed, what happens to me all the time now, I've realized in just like the past year or so, people find out, oh, there's this band called Titus Andronicus. They're supposed to be pretty good or whatever. I'll check them out. Or my friend says Titus Andronicus is good. I'm going to listen to him. Or I meet somebody in real life that doesn't know that I'm a musician. And they say, oh, you're in a band. What's it called? I say Titus Andronicus. They say, I'll check it out. So 100 out of 100 times when people go to check out this music, they go to Spotify or, whatever streaming service they're using. And they see that the most played Titus Andronicus song is called A More Perfect Union. And by far, it's the most played. It's the most popular song that we've got by a factor of 5. And so it's only right that these people will say, oh, well, I'll listen to this, and that will be my introduction to the music of Titus Andronicus. And then, so they press play on it, and they're expecting some kind of rock and roll song. And what instead they have is this elderly man reciting this speech from freaking, 170 years ago. And there's like weird noises percolating in the background, and there's like a whole minute of that before the band kicks in with like the real song. And lately it seems to me that has probably been a huge hindrance to, Titus Andronicus continuing to grow our audience, because everybody that's like, oh yeah, I'll check that band out, they go and they play the first song that they see, and it's not a fucking song. Like, they're not going to sit there for a whole minute, more likely than not. I think they probably, a lot of them, I think, have listened to 10 seconds and they're like, who's this elderly man? I'm turning this off. And then that's it with them and Titus Andronicus music. It never occurred to me until very recently, but I'd really have to wonder, like, how many people got Titus Andronicus recommended to them and maybe would have liked everything about the band and become huge fans of ours, but weren't able to sit through a whole minute of this strange monologue and just never came back. So I really wonder about that, and I do think that I might have totally fucked myself by achieving the absolute pinnacle of the whole opening a record with a little skit concept. But I guess if I could go back in time, I wouldn't change anything because it is so banging.
I will be as harsh as truth, as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard.
Another thing that you have to understand is that the Monitor album has like a certain structure. It's intended to be like a symmetrical thing. So there's 10 tracks on it, right? And the first track, A More Perfect Union, is kind of like a prologue. I kind of got the idea from Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew, which, as we recall, opens with a little scene where, this guy goes to attend a play, and then the play that he watches is, The Taming of the Shrew, and it's like a little framing story. So I was like, maybe I could do something kind of like that, because I'm already on this whole Shakespeare kick with this Titus Andronicus naming convention. So A More Perfect Union functions as a kind of prologue, and the 10th and final track, The Battle of Hampton Roads, functions as a kind of epilogue. As we move inward, each of those tracks has a neighbor, which is a variation of the same song. This is tracks 2 and track 8 are variations on the song Titus Andronicus Forever. And if you look on the liner notes, you see that the actual title is Titus Andronicus Forever, or Theme from the Monitor. So basically, like, More Perfect Union is kind of like the cold open, as we call it in the TV business. And then Titus Andronicus Forever, or Theme from the Monitor, is actually like, now we will actually begin the story. Like, the curtain is rising, and this is our theme song, which is, going to, like, try and encapsulate as concisely as possible the thesis statement of the album, which is that the enemy is everywhere. That's like the big, that's the lyric that everybody remembers. And with that song out of the way, then we will actually begin our proper story, which isn't even really like a linear story exactly, but more of like a series of, I guess, 6 vignettes that will each offer their own take on what it means for the enemy to be everywhere. And if you like, when we go through it and when we talk about each of the tracks, we can check in and say, where is the enemy now according to this particular song? That was the function of it, structurally speaking, was to say, this is what's happening. The enemy's everywhere. Get used to it. Let's talk about it. And now let's begin our show. This is my thesis, and now I'm about to beat you over the head with it until you see that indeed I am correct. I should say, like, this song, it only took me like about 30 seconds to write it. As soon as I hit upon this idea that the enemy is everywhere, that kind of already suggested the melody to me. And then once I had that, I was like, well, I can just put this over a blues riff. And then I came up with the second line, nobody seems to be worried or care that the enemy is everywhere. Meaning, like, the enemy being everywhere is a big problem, but the general public is like so anesthetized and so like numb to the world around them. They're not worried that the enemy is everywhere. They don't even care. They might not even know it because their head is so deep in the sand. So just to come up with those 2 lyrics and put them on top of a blues riff with the little rudimentary melody that occurred to me, that literally took about 30 seconds. Like, it took almost as long to write it as it takes to sing it, because it's just the same verse 3 times or whatever. So it was very, very easy thing to do. It was kind of like just there. I just had to like pull it from the earth like a potato and feast upon it. And, it was just, it's an iconic and memorable little song. That was just a gift. It was just a gift from heaven. God just dropped it into my lap and said, like, this will make your little rock opera or whatever the hell it is, concept album, a lot easier for the people to understand. And it's the gift that keeps on giving, because people love putting it in their movies and TV shows and stuff. Like, it was just in like last month or something. It was on this CBS procedural mystery drama show called Watson. And it's been in a bunch of other shit. It's been in the HBO show Bored to Death. It was in the movie Premium Rush, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays a New York City bike messenger who gets into trouble somehow. All these movies and TV shows like the idea of like having a song that tells their audience that the enemy is everywhere.
I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth.
No Future Part 3, as the title implies, is the third installment of the No Future saga, which is a little miniature series within the larger Titus Andronicus discography. No Future Parts 1 and 2 appear on the first record, The Airing of Grievances, and No Future Parts 4 and 5 appear on The Most Lamentable Tragedy, which is a rock opera we put out in 2015. But for the purposes of our discussion now, No Future Part 3, Escape from No Future, is the one on the monitor. So let's talk about that one. You know, not to get into a whole big thing about it, but the whole No Future saga is, you know, my little series of songs where I kind of discuss my experiences with, you know, what at the time I would have probably called like my melancholia or something, you know, or my little blue devils or my depressive tendencies. Because at the time of writing the Monitor album, I didn't really have an understanding of my own bipolarity. We can get into that a lot more in 5 years when we do the 15th anniversary of the rock opera episode. But for now, I'll just say throughout my life, I just have had this long history with different kind of psychopharmacological drugs. You know, like they put me on Ritalin when I was a kid, when I was like, you know, 5 or 6 or something. And they sent me off to this special school because I was such a problem child. And they sent me to all these different doctors and therapists and stuff, like to try and figure out why I was the way I was, why I was making so much trouble, why I couldn't behave, you know, like why I wasn't doing good in the regular school or like all this stuff. So I had a very short life before, you know, the decision was made that there needed to be a medical intervention, which was putting me on Ritalin. Over the years, like, you know, there's a long list of different drugs that they've given me to try and like make me a more productive, you know, member of society.
I used to look myself in the mirror at the end of every day, but I took the one thing that made me beautiful and I threw it away. Well, I was a river, I was a tall tree, I was a volcano, but now I'm asleep on top of a mountain. I've been covered in snow, 'cause I surrendered what made me human, and all that I thought was true. Now there's a robot that lives in my brain, he tells me what to do.
Around the time that I started writing songs for the second Titus Andronicus album, even before I had hit on the whole Civil War thing of it all, I was kind of like, you know, wrapping up my college career, or maybe I was like a junior at college or something, and just like very unhappy, like miserable, like absolutely hated my life, which makes a lot of sense in retrospect because, you know, this college was, you know, not the place for me. Like I had no friends. Like my classmates were the biggest bunch of fucking morons and assholes you could ever hate to meet. You know, they had a lot of good, you know, professors that taught me a lot of valuable things, but like, you know, this environment was just like not conducive at all to me, like, you know, having any kind of happiness or fulfillment. And everybody hated me. They all thought I was weird. They were exactly, the kind of fucking New Jersey bozos that I thought I was going to escape when I got out of high school. But, there they were anyway. And of course, there I was. And like I've been, troubled, tormented guy my entire life anyway. So eventually, I went to go see this doctor. And I told this guy, like, I'm pretty fucking miserable. Like, I'm a deeply unhappy person for the most part. And he's like, well, I'm going to give you this drug called Lexapro. And, we don't have to get into a big thing about it. That was not the right drug for me. But it was the drug that they gave me, and it was the drug that I took because I didn't know any better. That would come back to bite me in the ass, a few years later. And there's a whole other album about that. But for the purposes of our discussion about the Monitor, I went to this doctor with this problem that I had, which is that I was a very unhappy, miserable person. And he said, take this drug, this Lexapro, and, very possibly it'll make you feel better and you'll be happier. And I was like, well, that kind of sounds nice, I guess. So that's what I did. But as I, made the decision to go along with what he was suggesting, it gave me this feeling like I was like cheating or something, or I was like being somewhat inauthentic, or that I was like doing my authentic self, a disservice. This doctor tells me if I take this drug, then things are going to get better. I just wasn't completely convinced that that was like a good or fair thing for me to be doing, rightly or wrongly. It made me feel like a poser. It made me feel like kind of a sellout. It made me feel like I wasn't tough enough to feel the way that I was feeling and to deal with my life on its own terms. So I needed to take this drug to do for me what I couldn't do for myself, which was pull me out of the funk that I was in. And I'm not saying that that's right, that I felt that way. And I think that, there can be a lot of benefits to a lot of different kinds of medications and stuff. And I, continue to regulate my bipolarity with Lamictal nowadays. And if we go back to our thing about, the enemy's everywhere, right? So where is the enemy right now? For me, in No Future Part 3, the enemy is the part of myself that just can't get it together and just can't be happy for whatever reason. And I am going to combat this part of myself with the aid of this drug, this Lexapro. And, in the song I say, there's a robot that lives in my brain and he tells me what to do. That was my way of saying, I have forsworn trying to live as my authentic self. And I would prefer to be, a robot, to be an automaton. And just, if not actually be happy, at least numb myself through this drug to, the pain that I'm in and that I've been in for so long. And again, I'm not saying that I was right when I felt that way, but that was the way that I felt, or I felt it enough at that time that I wanted to make a song about it.
You will always be a loser. You'll always be a loser.
Again, I don't want to say kids at home, don't take your medicine because if you do, you're a poser. I'm definitely not saying that. If anything, I'm saying the opposite. There's so much of my my work and my career. There are moments in life when you feel these things, and these are valid feelings, and they deserve to be validated through song. I would never tell a kid not to take their medicine. I think there are good medicines and there are bad medicines, depending on who you are and what your issue is. And it can be a long and difficult process to find the right medication for you. But I do think it's a worthwhile thing to do if that's something that you need to do. And it's something that I have needed to do. At the time when I started taking this Lexapro, this was the way I felt. You know, every record is just kind of like a snapshot of where you're at. Ideally, on like a concept album like this, you would want the form and the function to kind of be aligned. So if I'm going with this Civil War motif or this extended metaphor, that can guide my lyric writing. It points in a certain direction with the music as well. And, you know, you'll notice there's a lot of like military type drum beats. Big salute to, you know, the fabulous Eric Harm, who did all the incredible drumming on this record. But the kind of the military beats, like the big, like major key melodies that were definitely informed by, you know, the old Civil War songs like, you know, Battle Hymn of the Republic, John Brown's Body, Battle Cry of Freedom, the kind of melodies that you could imagine being played on like a bugle. The idea was that, you know, the lyrical content and the musical content would mirror each other in such a way to, you know, create a, you know, a more cohesive whole. And it was useful for me as a songwriter once again, because, you know, in a world of, you know, infinite musical possibilities, this pointed me in a direction with the melodies and the arrangements and the sorts of beats, and that was helpful. I believe the title to be Richard II. And the song, the reason it has that name, I just happen to have the guitar here purely by coincidence. So if I can illustrate what I'm talking about, the reason that it's called Richard II is because there is a song called simply Richard, which is by a man named Billy Bragg, who is like one of my most, you know, important influences and heroes and role models at the time that I was writing this album. And on his debut EP, Life's a Riot, he had a song called Richard, and it went like this, right? Richard belongs to Jane. Jane belongs to yesterday. How can I go on when every alpha particle hides a neon nucleus? Okay, so if you take just the cadence of what he was singing and you do a little variation on the melody and put some different chords under it, then you get something that sounds like Richard belongs to Jane. Jane belongs to yesterday. How long can I go on? Every alpha particle hides a neon nucleus. Which is my song, Richard II. So basically, I just took the cadence as a scansion of the Billy Bragg song, and I came up with these different chords and this slight variation of the melody and started saying that I wrote it, which Billy Bragg would have been fine with because he did it all the time. And he's got a bunch of songs where he, you know, takes the melody or the scansion from, you know, a Bob Dylan song, or, you know, he's got songs where the tune is, you know, the Battle Hymn of the Republic or Cry of Freedom or whatever. So he was doing it all the time, and it was legal as far as he was concerned. So I said, I'm going to, you know, take a little bit of Billy Bragg's song, Richard, turn it into my own thing, and to kind of tip my hat to that, I will call the song Richard 2, which is also funny to me because, as we know, the name of the band, Titus Andronicus, comes from a Shakespeare play, and Shakespeare has a play called Richard II, which is about the titular king, which I did not read, but I definitely read Richard III, which was awesome.
There will be parties, there will be fun, there'll be talk for everyone, and we will all be sleeping easy on the sinking of the sun. But there's only one dream that I keep close, and it's the one of my hand I just throw.
But the title doesn't have anything to do with the subject matter, because when we went in to make the album, this song hadn't really been finalized. Like, I hadn't written the lyrics for this song. I might not have even finished them until we were actually like in the studio recording it. Because if you go back and you listen to the original demo tape that Titus Andronicus made that had all the songs from the second album, Richard 2 doesn't have any lyrics. It's just instrumental. So I guess I figured like I would just write the lyrics later. At the time that we were getting ready to record the album, I was dating this girl who was like quite a historian, especially about like New York City history. So I told her like, yeah, I'm almost done writing this album. I've got like this whole Civil War thing going on, but I got to finish, I don't have any lyrics for this one last song. And she was like, well, why don't you write a song about the New York City draft riots of 1863? And I was like, what's that? And so she got me this book by this guy named Ivor Bernstein, which helpfully is titled The New York City Draft Riots. And it tells the story of this riot that occurred over a couple of days in New York City. It was basically like the Irish immigrant population of New York City at that time just kind of went crazy and like ran amok for, a few different reasons. The first of which was that they didn't want to be drafted to fight in the Civil War and like possibly get killed. And they doubly didn't like the fact that under the law at that time, like if you were drafted or conscripted to fight in this Civil War, if you were wealthy enough, you could pay somebody to take your spot and you wouldn't have to actually go and fight in the war. You could get some poor person to do it, which is another thing that sounds a lot like, our modern day. And then the other thing that the Irish people were pissed about was they didn't like the black people, like they were just racist. They thought that if the slaves were freed in the southern states, then they were all going to come up north and they were going to start taking the jobs that the Irish people wanted for themselves, which sounds exactly like something you would hear today about this so-called, migrant invasion that they're always talking about on TV. So I'm reading this and I'm like, God damn, like these foolish Irish immigrants, they're acting a lot like you could see these people on TV spouting a lot of this same nonsense. So anyway, this riot that had began as like a protest against the draft or the conscriptions, as they called them, devolved quickly into like a race riot where the Irish were, performing all sorts of horrible atrocities against the black people in New York City, up to and including burning down an orphanage for black kids, which is like about as twisted a thing as you could possibly imagine. And I'm reading this book and reading about these atrocities, and I'm like, God damn, like, ain't that America for you? Like, here you have, the powers that be have like really divided like these people that should share, this common interest. And, now they don't even have to be bothered to, step on the little people because they're just killing each other because we've driven them so crazy through the evil machinations of our society. So I'm reading this book and I'm like, God damn, like I can't believe what they were doing. The lyrics just pretty much wrote themselves at that point. And I just took, images from the book and tried to like present them in such a way like, ain't this exactly what we're doing nowadays?
when I deny my humanity, I will be rolling in it like a pig in feces, 'cause there's no other integrity in awaiting the demise of our species. May you endure every indignity, knowing all the while life will go on. And when it is that you have nothing to say, so that it took too long. And may I be there somehow, asking where all of your friends now.
Like, I think this song is pretty cool, but I don't have like quite as much of a tender feeling for it as I do some of the other songs, because like it's kind of just like one musical idea, seen to its conclusion in kind of like a banging sort of like punk rock way, which is cool, but that's all it is. So like it feels like a little bit of a trifle compared to some of the other more ambitious songs. It's a great thing to, write like an awesome punk banger, but like, to do merely that, it doesn't thrill me as much as some of the other ones nowadays, but it's all right. How ironic, like how often do you come across an album where the most regular, least ambitious song on the record is the one that sticks out like a sore thumb? Typically, it's the opposite. You'll listen to a record and they have 9 regular songs and then one crazy off-the-wall weird one, and usually that's the one you notice. But when you're listening to this second Titus Andronicus album, the normal one seems weird. That's the kind of crazy, upside-down, topsy-turvy world into which I'm inviting the listener with this record.
The audience was large and brilliant. Upon my weary heart were showered smiles, plaudits, and flowers. But beyond them, I saw thorns and troubles innumerable.
It was a dragon GPA. We got a couple of gun grades, and it sounded like a pretty girl seven.
I could see how, to like an outsider, like a band singing about what it's like to be in a band could probably be like a little alienating or maybe like hard to relate to, but it's the life I was living at the time, so I gave myself license to do so. And the song Upon Which to Piss is just kind of about my experience navigating the music industry during, what we now look at as like the indie rock boom years, and there's this like this system of, these so-called indie record labels, certain, online music publications. There's these different sorts of festivals, music conferences, etc. And, they're writing books about this time period now. But that song was like my on the ground reporting on what it was like for me going through that. And once again, I was a little bit of a house divided amongst itself, because on the one hand, I was getting what I wanted. Like I was like kind of a big shot, sort of like in this little world, in this little corner of the music business. Like I was getting to do what I'd hoped, which is, go travel around and do all the concerts, and pretty soon we're going to make another album, and that's all great. And I'm running around America with my boys, and like we're partying and getting drunk and high and like doing and rocking the house every night and making a big noise with the amplifiers, and that's all great. But at the same time, there was shit about doing it that was just like whack. Like I didn't really think it was that awesome to like go to South by Southwest and like be like glad handing people, or like, sucking up to people, kissing people's ass. Like that's not really my thing.
No, too much fun, getting drunk and sad and singing. I'm at the end of
I didn't like going on the internet and seeing people ragging on me and saying that Titus Andronicus was whack. And this was, in the early days of, internet trolling and stuff. And this is why, for the opening spoken part of the song, I had my friend Cassie Ramone, who we remember from the great band Vivian Girls. She reads the opening speech, which is taken from Jefferson Davis's memoir. Jefferson Davis was the president of the so-called Confederate States of America, which was the United States' opponent in the Civil War. And Cassie reads, the audience was large and brilliant. Upon my weary heart were showered flowers, smiles, and plaudits. But beyond them, I saw thorns and troubles innumerable. So that to me, kind of, not saying Jefferson Davis did the right thing by leading that Confederacy, but I could kind of relate in a way to what he was saying. He had been made the president of this fledgling nation, and everybody's cheering for him and saying, you're the greatest guy, you're about to be our big hero. But he knows, this is actually, I'm actually in pretty deep shit now as I embark on this thing that I'm undertaking. So that was kind of where my head was at. It's awesome that everybody's clapping for me and telling me I'm the man, but at the same time, it's you might have been, better to be a little more careful about what you wish for, because I'm dealing with all this other bullshit. And Cassie Ramone and the Vivian Girls were at the time, the recipients of a lot of really toxic attention on the internet. And particularly in the comments section of a website called Brooklyn Vegan that was very popular at the time. And people in the comments section would say terrible, vicious, misogynistic things about Vivian Girls, which was a fantastic band that made a bunch of great songs and records. And my friend, besides, so I was pissed off and offended on their behalf. And I felt Cassie, I knew, and we had talked about it, she could understand this whole thing of we wanted, to pursue the music thing. And in a way, our careers were going great. But at the same time, it came with a lot of unwanted stuff that we never asked for.
It wasn't a flattering photograph, and people saw it all over town, hanging up in the wall above the urinal. Hear a man with a notepad say, oh, that's funny, but they drink too much. They don't be surprised if they don't amount to nothing at all. And we were talking about giving up, we were talking about lying down, we were talking about tying up. Wasn't it supposed to be something now?
A Pot in Which to Piss is kind of the weird, musically, it's kind of the most out there song on the record. It goes in a lot of weird directions and takes little unexpected detours in kind of that sort of happiness is a warm gun, paranoid android, Bohemian Rhapsody kind of way. And the way that happened was that getting towards the end of the writing process for the record, I realized I've got maybe 5 or 6 riffs or musical ideas that I like that are kind of homeless right now. They're kind of orphan ideas. So why don't I just put them all in the same key of E major and kind of see what sort of wild madcap journey I can put together for the listener. So that's exactly what I did. So there's kind of a ballady sort of swirling shoegaze kind of part. There's a kind of more Clash kind of skronky part. There's a doo-wop Spectre girl group kind of wordless part. There's a rock and roll a boogie woogie part. There's just a lot going on in an album that kind of makes a point of doing stuff like that. and taking these twists and turns. This was sort of like the ultimate expression of that kind of idea as far as like a musical idea goes. So it's appropriate then, I guess, that it's like right smack in the middle of the record.
I've been called out, cuckolded, castrated, but I survived. I am covered in urine and excrement, but I'm alive. And there's a white flag in my pocket, never to be unfurled.
So Craig Finn, he was another one of these guys who was nice enough to let me visit him with my little trusty 4-track cassette recorder, and I asked him to read a poem from Walt Whitman, Vigil Strange on the Field I Kept, I believe it's called, which is from the perspective of a soldier during the Civil War who I guess, has this, he's like in love with this other guy, this other soldier, and that guy gets killed in battle, and he just has this, this moment of burying his lover on the battlefield, and it's a very powerful piece of poetry. And Craig Finn is like kind of like a Walt Whitman figure to me, because he's a New York City guy. I mean, he's from Minneapolis originally, but he's working out of New York and singing about New York stuff. And he has like an incredible faculty for poetry and for using words to, really beautiful ends. But at the same time, he's kind of like a jolly, saucy guy. He's like a very gregarious, big-hearted sort of person. So Walt Whitman, is kind of like the Civil War poet. Like, he was not a soldier in it, but he was a nurse. So if you're going to do a Civil War album and you're going to have these spoken interludes, Walt Whitman is the guy that you're going to want to utilize. And Craig Finn is, was as close to Walt Whitman as I had in my Rolodex at the time. So he was nice enough to read that. It was backstage at a concert in New Jersey when the first time that Titus Andronicus opened for the Hold Steady. And he just banged it out backstage in 1 or 2 takes. And it's one of, many times over the years that he was there for me when I needed him. And, he's a really, he's a good man. And has always kind of looked out for me as sort of like an older guy in the scene that's, trying to do a version of what he did. So big salute to him as well.
And there and then, and bathed by the rising sun, my son in his grave, in his rude dark grave I deposited, ending my vigil strange with that. Vigil of night and battlefield dim. Vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding. Vigil for comrades swiftly slain, vigil I never forget. How as day brightened, I rose from the chill ground and folded my soldier well in his blanket and buried him where he fell.
This is a war we can win. After 10,000 years, it's still us against them.
Well, this song 4score and 7 wasn't like quite as much of like a super glue job as Pot in Which to Piss was, because the two halves of the song like seem pretty different, I guess, but they were kind of written together. I knew that I wanted to have, and go from like kind of a sort of a pretty ballad with like the piano and the trumpets and stuff, and go into like a much more raucous kind of punk thing. But there are a lot of things that unite them. They are in the same key of C major, and they always were. They both are, utilizing what we musicians call the major pentatonic scale, which again is, what a lot of those old Civil War songs are based around that scale. The waltz time, it's in a, 6/8 time signature. So it's just kind of like, they're not exact copies of each other, but, the two parts share enough in common that I think they make sense together. And it's kind of like, just like a, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of thing, where it's, talking about the same concept, but, doing a more like plaintive version of it at the beginning and then a more like amped up, assertive, aggressive, like angrier version of it at the end.
When they see the kind of person that you really are, then you won't be laughing so hard. No, you won't be laughing so hard. No, you won't be laughing. You won't be laughing. No, you won't be laughing. You won't be laughing. No, you won't be laughing. You won't be laughing.
407 was another song that, much like A More Perfect Union, that I wrote in the car. And I can remember very vividly pulling over to jot down, the lyrics of the faster section, which is the second half of it, on a back of like, I guess probably like a 12-pack of beer. It was definitely written on cardboard of some kind, or maybe like a box of saltine crackers or something, like whatever kind of cardboard, maybe pizza box, something like that. But it was definitely a Sharpie on cardboard job that I did on that one. But it was just the product of, more and more of those long drives and just thinking about this whole thing of what we now call tribalism, this need people seem to have to search for conflict as a means of defining themselves and giving themselves purpose. For whatever reason, like people seem, more secure when they're acting, in opposition to something, or when they're engaged in some kind of conflict. They seem to feel like their lives are more fulfilling or have more purpose. And it really kind of doesn't matter what the conflict is. It's just like they seem to want to run towards that state of just being in conflict against what it could be anything, and this has, repeated itself throughout history. And that's why I say at the opening of the song, this is a war we can't win. After 10,000 years, it's still us against them. Us against them is not really like a very useful descriptor for a meaningful conflict, but it seems to be like more than good enough for most people. People seem to like live their life and adopt these sorts of positions and these ideologies just like they're rooting for their favorite sports team. The Democrats, the Republicans, we don't have to get into a whole big thing about it. But it just seems to me, or it seemed to me at the time, that if this us versus them mentality is like the main thing that's guiding us and informing like all the decisions that we're making as individuals and as a society, then we're actually never going to really make any progress, which would make it, the war we can't win, like I sang about. And, the whole history of human civilization apparently, for some people doesn't provide enough evidence that, this bickering and, this whole, fuck you attitude that people have and that they cherish so much in place of actually like believing in something or trying to actually achieve something constructive. Our whole human history has not been sufficient to convince these people that maybe we need to think differently about how we're gonna, work together to, achieve a more perfect union, for lack of a better term.
Since our forefathers came on this land, we've been coddling those we should be running through. Please don't wait around for them to come and shake hands. They're not gonna be waiting for you. 'Cause these humans treat humans like humans treat us. They get used up, coughed up, and fried in a pan. But I wasn't born to die like a dog. I was born to die just like a man. I was born to die just like a man.
I will say, America is a great idea. America is the best idea anybody ever had. This notion of a place and a society where everyone is equal, where everyone is entitled to the same rights. These rights that cannot be given or taken away by any earthly force. These rights that are endowed unto us by God, for lack of a better term, you know? The idea of a place where if you work hard and you're honest and you do the right thing, that you are rewarded. That's great. A place where there are no limits to how high you can climb if you're willing to do the work is a great idea. The idea that everybody's opinion is worth the same, that everybody gets the same vote, that everybody gets the same chance to succeed is a great idea. Obviously, that's not the real world. That place has never existed. People love to say, oh, like the so-called founding fathers were like so full of shit. Like they didn't think that everyone was created equal. They literally owned slaves. And like, of course they were full of shit, but that doesn't mean that they didn't let an important genie out of the bottle when they wrote those beautiful words that they didn't actually mean. They put an idea out into the world that I think is important. And people nowadays and people throughout history have wanted to, you know, throw out the baby with the bathwater and say like America is such like a fucked up place and like the American government does so much evil at home and around the world. And of course that's all true. But that doesn't mean that the idea of America is not important. The idea of America is both important and beautiful, and it's worth fighting for in whatever, you know, shape that takes. It's worth preserving, and it's worth trying to actualize the promise of America. And, you know, a lot of people will tell you that, you know, we're further away from fulfilling that promise than we've ever been. And that may be so, but the promise remains. The idea is out there. The genie is out of the bottle. If you just give up and you say, okay, well, you know, you people on the other side, you want to, you know, wave the American flag around and say that you represent the real America, whatever that even means, then you can have it. You can take the flag because I don't even want it and I don't like America. I do not share that defeatist attitude. I believe in the America that was promised in our Declaration of Independence, even if it never existed and maybe never will exist. I care about it. It's important to me and it belongs to me. It doesn't belong to, you know, these people that try and turn it into something ugly and hateful. It should belong to the people that want it to be what it is, which is something inclusive and beautiful and belongs to everybody. I like that. That's where I'm at with America. Well, Kevin McMahon definitely outdid himself on that song on 4score and 7. And like one of the most vivid memories of that whole time in the studio was, you know, we recorded the backing track as like a regular rock band and Eric was just back there playing his regular drum set. And then Kevin was like, you know, you're all into this like military drum beat thing. Why don't I go ahead and let's get a couple other drums and we'll have Eric like overdub some more like snares and tom-toms and stuff on this one big important dramatic part. And we were like, all right, Kevin, you're the boss. And so we did it. And then, you know, we came in the control room and Kevin, you know, turned his knobs and like the sound that came out of the speakers just like blew everybody's heads off. And we were like, holy shit, like that is the craziest sounding thing. It was one of those moments where we were like, damn, like we're kind of like, something's happening here. Like we're onto something. so many times that Kevin, came through with, either like an idea or, just like executing an idea that we had, like with the technological know-how and the finesse to actually take like, like a goofy off the wall thing that we wanted to do and like actually manifest it in the real world in a way that like, would make sense to the listener and be like really pleasing and sonically exciting. So hell of a producer, that guy, in a lot of ways. He was the engineer of, the first decade plus of all the Titus Andronicus recordings. He recorded and produced our first CDR EP when the band was only like, 3 or 4 months old. He recorded our first and second 7-inches, and he recorded and produced the first Titus Andronicus album, The Airing of Grievances. And even though we had received at the time what seemed like a lot of money as an advance from our then label Troubleman Unlimited, it was about, $2,500. That seemed like an unspendable, like infinite amount of money. But naturally, we ran through it pretty fast. But Kevin McMahon, really believed in us and wanted us to, have the best possible debut record that we could. So he cut us a lot of breaks. And he let us pay him in like, amplifiers and effect pedals that were like mostly broken. And he cut us a lot of slack. So it was only natural. And I couldn't have been more thrilled when we had this deal with XL. I basically took that entire advance and I just, plopped it down in front of him. And I said, this money is yours now. And how many days in a row is that going to get me in this studio of yours? And I guess it ended up getting me about like, almost 30 days. Well, if you want to understand this record, The Monitor, and this Titus Andronicus band in general, you have to know about a band called Spider Bags, who were and are a band from North Carolina led by a fellow named Dan McGee, who is just one of the greatest guys that I ever knew and has been like such an enormous inspiration for me over my whole career. The song theme from Cheers was very much a conscious and deliberate attempt to write a song in the style of Spider Bags. And if you listen to that first Spider Bags album, A Celebration of Hunger, you'll see like, all the stuff from the themes of Cheers, is just Frankenstein together from different songs from that first Spider Bags album. If I take the drum beat from one song and put the chords from another song on top of it, and, Spider Bags, sang a lot about drinking. I was having my own, feelings about alcohol and, substance usage in general at that time. And the fact that, I am often trying to numb myself to the reality of my life to dull the pain of being alive. Not unlike on No Future Part 3 with the Lexapro stuff. But this time it was using alcohol to do it. Spider Bags offers me like the perfect musical jumping off point to discuss these things.
I'm sorry, mama, but I'm drinking again. Me and the old man got us a head start on the weekend. And rest assured tonight I'm gonna be in Kevin's basement with all my friends, provided we can get a lazy asses down to bottle king by 10.
Spider Bag style was like a little bit more country leaning, but still like very much rocking and had really like a punk mentality and a punk energy, but utilized more like, classic kind of American song forms. They would get compared like a lot to Silver Jews at the time, but they were like far more rocking, like hard rocking than Silver Jews. But Dan had kind of like a deep voice, sort of like David Berman had, and they had like a lot of incredible things going on in the lyrics. His perspective on life and the poetics that he would use to articulate it, and like how just really like strong and sturdy these songs he was writing were, just like one classic after another, like songs that seemed like they would have just been around forever. And so it was like huge for us. And so when Spiderbags came and played in New York City, we were able to convince them to come and do an afternoon concert in Ian Graetzer's garage, which was where we practiced. And like all the kids from, Glen Rock came out to this matinee concert, and we just like 30 youngsters in the garage watching Spiderbags, and all the guys in Titus Andronicus being like, this is it. Like, these guys are as good as it gets. Like, this is so awesome. All of this, culminated beautifully for me when Dan McGee of Spiderbags, that incredible guy I admire so much, he actually made the long drive all the way from North Carolina up to New Paltz and sang the song as a duet with me. I don't think he'd ever even heard the song before, but he came up and we listened to it a few times, and I wrote out the lyrics for him, and in like 4 or 5 tries or something, he just banged it out and gave that beautiful performance and really gave me, that authentic Spiderbag sound that I was so desperately trying to emulate.
I'm sorry, Mama, expect a call from the neighbors tonight. All of my asshole buddies are coming over and they're being a little too alright. I'm sick and tired of everyone in this town being so goddamn uptight. Don't you worry, I do all the talking when I turn on the flashing lights. When I'm an old man, I can be the quiet type, and I can go without a moment of fun for the rest of my life.
I could have probably been forgiven for just keeping that song more regular, especially since the lyrics talk about, being kind of like a lazy bum and a drunkard. But I guess I just couldn't help myself, and I had to do another like paranoid android type thing where I was like, well, I've got, 2 more riffs or song ideas that are also in G major, and I can put, drinking lyrics on top of those as well. So why don't I just go for it? And that's what I did, because I was just incorrigible back then. Like, I just couldn't stop writing the songs until there was nothing, there was no more road left in front of me. Could be accused of, overwriting some of them perhaps, but I think this theme from Cheers 1 turned out pretty okay, all things considered.
Doing this anymore. So handy, let's turn into dirty old men. Close down the bar every night at the Glen Rock. Talk about our grandkids as we stroke our gray beards. Funny, we're still doing car bombs after all of these years.
Well, believe it or not, To Old Friends and New is actually the first song that I wrote on that album. And I didn't write it for the album. It was a very old song even then. Like, that song was on our original 5-song CDR EP that we recorded in 2005 that we would sell at the shows. The last track on that EP was me doing like a solo piano version of that song, To Old Friends and New. And when we were going to do the first album, the Airing of Grievances, there was a notion that we were going to do like a full like rock band arrangement of the song. But then when we actually sat down and said, okay, these are the 10 songs that we got, the track list was going to be too long and it wasn't going to fit on one 12-inch vinyl record. And Mike Simonetti at Troubleman Unlimited was clear, like, this has to be one 12-inch. Like, we're not doing a double album for this. So you can have, 52 minutes instead of, 45 or whatever. So we were like, I guess we're going to cut one song. And to Old Friends and New, like, we already kind of had a ballad on the album already with No Future Part 1. And the rock band arrangement of To Old Friends and New was not really, like, quite up to snuff anyway. So we're like, one of these ballads has got to go. And so it was To Old Friends and New that ended up getting left on the cutting room floor. And we never even actually attempted to record it for the first album. But, going into the second one, I think it ended up being a blessing because thematically, like, it fits much better with what's going on the monitor. And indeed, it kind of becomes, it's sort of like the emotional centerpiece of the entire thing. And sometimes that's how it is. Here's another tip for artists. Like, if you're doing your second album or, your fifth or sixth or whatever, you're trying to start writing a new record, one good place to start is look at whatever songs you have just lying around that haven't been on a record yet. And as you're cataloging them, these leftovers or these loose songs that you've got, maybe, take a look and see if there's any themes or motifs or ideas that are unifying those songs, and you could potentially use that, like, to guide you towards, creating however many other songs you need for the record. So that's a little bit what happened here. To Old Friends and New is very much a song about conflict and people with a common interest that find themselves, at odds. And how can I put this diplomatically? It really gets my goat a lot of the time when people reduce The Monitor to being a so-called breakup album, because indeed it does address the dissolution of the romantic relationship I had that made me move up to Boston in the first place. But the song that people point to as evidence for this being a so-called breakup album, that's the only song that has any romantic content whatsoever. The other 9 songs don't allude to any sort of romance. And in the opening track, when I say I'm moving up to Boston, I don't say, like, I'm moving up there because I'm in love, or I want to, I got to go see about a girl, like Good Will Hunting. Like, that's not, it never says that. But people get, hung up, they get stuck on this To Old Friends and New song, and they say, oh, well, this is, the smoking gun that proves the entire point of this album is crying over some failed romance. And I think that's unfairly reductive. Because, like I said, the meat of the album is these 6, like, vignettes that all take their own little look at, these conflicts that we have, as within our society, within our interpersonal relationships, within our own selves and the different, parts of our own psyche. And so the conflicts that inevitably arise within any romantic relationship, that would be certainly something to talk about if you're making an album about these different sorts of conflicts. So that's what I did with this one. But, the fact that it's the only song on the record that talks about anything to do with romance, and it was already 5 years old when the record came out, I think people are a little misguided in that.
Like the time traveler who feels great, follow these cycles are bringing me down. We could build a nice life together if we don't kill each other first. Are you just too fucked up to understand me, or is it the other way around?
another big thing that was going on in the early days of like the Titus Andronicus professional touring career is that, in our travels, we would come across some like-minded, musicians about, kind of our same age or at sort of the same stage of their careers. And lots of times we would be fortunate enough to, become buddies with them. And one great example of that was the band Y Oak, who are, fantastic. At the time, two-piece band of Jen Wasner and Andy Stack. Anybody would be, well advised to go and check out any of their records because they're all really cool and all pretty different. But at the time, Y Oak was just like us. They were, some scrappy kids that were, trying to make a go of it. And we played with them a bunch of times in a bunch of different cities just by chance. They were living in Baltimore at the time. So we played with them a bunch and got to be friendly with them. And of course, all you need is, 2 ears and a heart to see that, like, they were tremendously talented. When I found that I had this, kind of like sort of a romantic ballad to do, I was like, maybe I can get somebody to sing this as a duet with me, even though it wasn't originally written as a duet. But if I make it a duet, maybe that will kind of reinforce this thing that I'm going for. There's two sides to every story. And our narrator of the Monitor album is, quite the finger-pointing, uptight, kind of high horse guy. So maybe, if we're going to open the window and let a little light in on this song and start to be a little more compassionate and merciful towards, the so-called other that's on the opposite end of some of these conflicts we're exploring, maybe doing it as a duet could go a long way towards achieving that. And so then it was like, okay, well, who's my friend with the most beautiful voice? Oh, well, Jen Wasner, of course. So she was nice enough to agree to do it. We took a little band field trip down to Baltimore. And not only did she sing the second verse beautifully, she was like, I'll do some harmonies on the bridge as well. And I was like, great. So that was, she sang that just as beautifully as the verse. And then I was like, hey, as long as you're here, like, why don't you just fucking do the guitar solo as well? Because she's also great at that. So she kind of like, came in and pretty much like took over that song, which I couldn't have been more thrilled about because she had some ideas that she executed fantastically and, brought this whole other character and this whole other different musical skill set to the record. So she'll always have a special place in my heart for that, and I always owe her a big debt of gratitude.
Was it the dawn? Was it the Lord who gave you those words? Ones I never heard. It's alright to kill and it's alright to steal if you're willing to hold up your part of the deal. There are plenty of things that are worth dying for, but you'll never know until you open that door.
One thing to know about me is that my all-time favorite musician, songwriter, rock star is Lou Reed. And I think, there's so many great things about him, but the most amazing thing that he did across his career was he turned a really compassionate gaze towards people that were really marginalized by society, people that were subject to serious degradation. Transgender people, junkies, not to conflate the two, but like, people that in the 1960s and 70s were really looked down upon. Lou had like a lot of sympathy and compassion for them, and he turned that into, many beautiful songs. And, once again, I just happened to have the guitar here, and he had a song. There was a song that Lou wrote for the second Velvet Underground album that they ended up not using, that appeared on the Peel Slowly and See box set. It went something like, I don't care about your present pay and the nightlife you keep burning. I don't care what your old man says and the ways you have of learning. 'Cause it's alright the way that you live. It's alright the way that you live. And so I heard that and I was like, that sounds nice. So I just went, it's alright the way that you live. It's alright the way that you live. I basically took the same words, same chords, changed the time signature. It's alright the way that you live. It's alright the way that you live. Just kind of, if you're going to steal, you should steal from the best. So Lou helped me out with that one. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. May he rest in peace. And from there, I just kind of gave myself the task of, being as compassionate towards my subject as he was to his, which is basically, this romantic partner that I have. We're kind of on the rocks a little bit, but I'm trying to recognize, even though you are being pretty fucking annoying and getting on my nerves and making my life difficult right now, I recognize that I'm probably being pretty fucking annoying and making your life pretty difficult. But I think I'm doing my best, and I need to extend you the same compassion and offer you the same grace that I would wish for myself. For the most part, people, generally mean pretty well, and you gotta just try and cut people some slack.
It's all right the way that you live. It's all right the way that you live. It's
If Titus Andronicus Forever was the opening credits to our little show, which was the 6 little vignettes, then, when we've reached the end of that, then we have ellipses and ever. Titus Andronicus Forever and ever, which is kind of wrapping things up and trying to tie a little bow around everything and create this symmetrical structure for our album and our little story. You'll notice the lyrics are pretty similar, but dissimilar in one important way. Because on the original one, Titus Andronicus Forever, it says, the enemy's everywhere, but nobody seems to be worried or care that the enemy is everywhere. So that's that kind of outward-looking, finger-pointing mentality that our narrator has as he embarks upon this journey. When we get to the end, and it's the reprise, the lyric now is, the enemy's everywhere. I'm worthless and weak, I'm sick and I'm scared, and the enemy is everywhere. So it is an inward looking, it is a self-critical reflection of the same statement and the same sentiment. And that is kind of, starting to hint at what, the moral of the story was all along. If the enemy is everywhere, that means the enemy is also within. And beautiful harmony vocals by Kevin McMahon on this track, by the way. His big singing moment on the record, he sets me up with the sorts of harmonies that Keith Richards would have done for Mick Jagger on those great old Stones records. So that was a big surprise because he did that when we weren't around. And he claimed that he had gotten a special guest to come do it, that he wouldn't say who it was. And then he played it for us a couple of times and we were like, wait a second, this is you singing. And he was like, I don't know who it is.
everywhere.
The Battle of Hampton Roads is actually the only song on the record that actually addresses the title of the record, because the Monitor was a ship that was built by the United States. It was the first battleship to be made completely out of iron, which made it like a lot less vulnerable to cannon fire. And they needed to do it and fast because the Confederacy had already built an ironclad warship, which was called the Merrimack. And what they had done was they had taken a regular wooden battleship and just grafted iron plates onto the exterior of it. But even that was enough that the Merrimack was, the scourge of the seas at that time and completely, ran through, the whole United States Navy. So the U.S., or the Union, as they were sometimes called then, had to go out and build this fully iron battleship. And there's a great book about this called The Duel of the Ironclads. And this was another thing that I learned about in the first episode or two of the Ken Burns Civil War documentary that had me completely flabbergasted, like that I'd never heard of this before, like this amazing moment in naval history. Learning about these ships and this battle of Hampton Roads, when the Monitor and the Merrimack finally went head to head, was just like so incredible to me. And that was, watching that and learning about that in the movie and reading the book made it pretty clear to me. This is like the image, like this is what I'm going to use. This is going to be like the album title. This is going to be this is going to be like the metaphor that's going to like tie this whole thing together.
The mystic cords of memory stretching from battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature.
Tonight, two great ships will pull back to their ports, depleted of everything that shoots flames and reports.
This famous Battle of Hampton Roads ultimately ended in a stalemate because neither ship could sink the other. They were each too powerful. They were too evenly matched. So, they fired at each other like a bunch, like for hours and hours and hours to no avail. And ultimately, they each just, retreated, having to recognize the futility of this battle that they were engaged in, that neither side was going to be able to claim a decisive victory. And that, to me, was an apt metaphor for, so many of the conflicts that I was already, writing about and trying to, report on in my songs. So many of these conflicts that were just never really going to amount to anything constructive, that were never going to be decided in any kind of sound, definitive manner. And of course, if you wanted, you could look at it and say that, these two ships, are me and the girlfriend that I couldn't work it out with. That would probably be a fair interpretation of that lyric. But again, I don't think it's exclusively that. I think that's one way to interpret it if you're so inclined, if you're really hung up on this breakup album concept. But it just was, to me, it was, the perfect metaphor to kind of speak about the futility of these conflicts.
That there is no race more human, no one throws it away like they do. Nothing I used to love, I've come to reject. Nothing I used to hate, I've learned to accept. And the worst of the three you now have to expect. Satan ain't hard to see without craning your neck.
This song was written with the express intent of being the grand finale. Lyrically, it was going to tie everything up. it was the epilogue of this whole story where I was going to kind of summarize everything that I'd been through, and I was going to present my conclusions and share what it was that I had learned, or, the narrator, whoever you want to call him. So that was part of my purpose, but at the same time, I do still have this crazy dream that I'm making the greatest rock album of the century so far, and I want it to be like an earth-shaking event for the listener. So I'm like, well, this is the end of the story. This is the time, to really go for it. Let's really swing for the fences. We're going to leave nothing on the table. We're going to pull out all the stops. We're going to use every trick in the book. We're going to put on all the cheat codes. When you go and you pull the bagpipes out, then you're playing with the cheat codes on. And we're going to harmonize the guitars. We're going to do everything we can possibly think of and just blow it up into this gargantuan, larger than life epic in the way that, Springsteen had done on Jungle Land for the Born to Run album, just to name one example. But more than that, bigger than that was the goal. And just to take the listener on this journey from where at the beginning it's just me and the guitar, and I'm doing a Billy Bragg type thing, with just a regular little lonely singer-songwriter vibe. And then, then we get the kick drums coming in, and things are ramping up. And then it's well, now let's do a whole drum beat with the kick drum and the snare. And now the bass is going, and little by little just adding and adding all these things. And just, building up to this fit of ecstasy, because this is what else are you supposed to do if you're trying to make the greatest album of the century. This is, this is just how it's done. You better have some kind of grand finale. So that was what we attempted to do.
Destroying everything that wouldn't make me more like Bruce Springsteen. So I'm going back to New Jersey. I do believe they've had enough of me.
It is kind of an exact mirror image of the opening track, More Perfect Union, where I'm leaving New Jersey and I'm going to Boston with a lot of hope and a lot of optimism and ambition. And then here on the closing track, the reflection, we see that I am returning to New Jersey, leaving Boston, and feeling, kind of defeated, having been through kind of a sobering experience, and having a different sort of perspective on all those themes that we'd just been talking about, but ultimately realizing that in all the conflicts in which I was engaged, I was a more than willing participant, and everything that I had accused my opponents of, I too was guilty of those same things, which I guess is kind of the moral of the story. That's why, at the end of the song, I say, my enemy, it's your name on my lips as I go to sleep, and I know what little I've known of peace. I've done to you what you've done to me, and I'd be nothing without you. My darling, please don't ever leave. With that long verse at the end of the song about how I'm going to smoke cigarettes, I'm going to drink, I'm going to run around the country screaming my head off, I'm going to do all this stuff, I ain't backing down. I'm doubling down on all those things. It's kind of similar, I guess, to the last verse of Bob Dylan, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, where he says, how he's going back out, where black is the color, none is the number. And this kind of thing, I am bloodied and bruised and defeated in a way, but I'm still at it. I ain't really changed, but I've learned a few things. If nothing else, I'm recognizing my own complicity in the structures around me, and I'm starting to take a little bit more accountability and open myself to the possibility that maybe I am not completely blameless for my own misery. I might be the architect of my unhappiness to a certain degree. Maybe that's, just a tiny step towards, thinking a little more critically and just going about your life with a little bit more intention and not just kind of blindly casting about and doing things without really thinking of them.
So now when I drink, I'm going to drink to excess, and when I smoke, I will smoke, gaping holes in my chest, and when I scream, I will scream until I'm gasping for breath, and when I get sick, I will stay sick for the rest of my days, peddling hate at the back of the shed. The express, each one a fall in the face of your idea of success. And if this be thy will, then fucking pass me the cup. And I'm sorry, Dad, no, I'm not making this up.
Like a few years after this record came out, this guy named Gabe, who was a student at Occidental College in California, sent me this term paper that he wrote about the album, where he did like a really incredible job of explaining it, like better than I possibly could and better than I've done on this podcast so far. But Gabe basically explained how, like, you know, after we come to this conclusion about how I, the narrator, have been playing the same rotten games that my so-called enemies have, and I too am guilty of othering them and trying to cast them as the cause of all my problems. That's kind of like a sad thing to realize, or that could be like a moment of like a guilt or shame for the narrator, you know, recognizing his complicity. But the music doesn't reflect that. It doesn't sound ashamed. It sounds less ashamed than ever. It sounds more shameless than ever, because that's when we get the bagpipes and we get the harmonized guitars and the whole kitchen sink arrangement. So I guess the point of all that was to say, like, okay, we've gone through this whole kind of disheartening, disenfranchising, sobering experience, and learn to recognize our own complicity in these systems. But at least we learned something. And like we've had like an epiphany. Things are clearer than they were before. Whether or not we choose to take it, there may now be illuminated a path forward where we could hopefully grow as a person and become, you know, kinder and more compassionate. If you look at it from a certain angle, that would potentially be something to celebrate. And that could be a joyous moment at the same time as it is kind of a moment of sadness and shame. As far as the literary angle of it, that maybe is why the ending is so grandiose and ecstatic, even when the conclusion is maybe, you know, not quite so joyous. As soon as we got done recording it, we went right back out and started doing the concerts again. Like, we went right from the studio to the airport to go over to England and play the Reading Festival. And then from there, you know, we came back home and went straight out on the road and toured around the whole USA for like, you know, 40 days or so. And so we weren't even hardly around very much, like when it was getting mixed. You know, Kevin McMahon just did all the mixes while we were out on the road, and he would, you know, email them to us, and we would check them out and you know, approve them or give tiny little notes here and there. So there wasn't even like much time to stop and like think about, you know, the job that we'd done, because we were right back on the treadmill and right back at the old grind out there doing the gigs. And, you know, listening to these mixes, like listening to these songs that you spent so long on, but, you know, you're playing them on the headphones, like off the iPhone or whatever in a parking lot or like an alleyway behind a rock club. It's not like, you don't really it's not the most conducive environment for thinking like, holy shit, like I'm such a genius. Like I can't believe it, this masterpiece that I've made. But I felt pretty satisfied that we definitely given it everything we got. That's all that I could really ask, because like even by like the end of the tour that we did while Kevin was mixing the album, like I can remember, the last show in New York City at the old Brooklyn location of the Knitting Factory, like getting done with the concert and looking out and there's like, oh shit, there's only like 100 people here. Like, a year ago, it would have been like 200 or 300. Like this project is maybe like running out of steam. So maybe it's a good thing that we didn't leave anything on the table when we made the second record, because the way things are going, there probably won't be a third one. So maybe it's not too late for me to go back to graduate school or something. It's not going to keep me up at night in the future wondering like, oh, if only I'd, taken a little bit of a bigger swing, or if only I'd, hadn't been so cowardly to like, follow through on my biggest, most grandiose ideas. I was open to the idea that that was what the Monitor was going to be good for, was just helping me to not live with a certain type of regret. But then in January of 2010, somehow it got on the internet, like it leaked. That was a thing that used to happen in those days. Records would leak ahead of schedule. And I don't know why, but, people started sharing it a lot on, Napster and SoulSeek and stuff. And it started like picking up a lot of steam. And next thing you knew, like when it came time to do the record release show at New York's, Bowery Ballroom, all of a sudden, we're playing for an audience of 600 people and they all know the words to the record that came out that day. And so I was like, oh shit, like the train might be leaving the station again. And so, my little crazy adventure got, a couple years added on. When it came out, it got like a lot of, pretty good reviews. And they started to, like put us in like the magazines and stuff. Like we had our picture in like Rolling Stone and Spin magazine. Like I can remember, my stepmother, she got the issue of Spin magazine that we were in that had our little picture in it. And she was like, I remember when you were a kid, you used to read this magazine every month and now you're in it. Like she had like tears in her eyes. She was so proud. So that was nice. And then we, started getting all these like different opportunities. Like, pretty soon we were fucking on TV, like, on the Jimmy Fallon show. When I tell people about it now, I just say that we were on Jimmy Fallon. I don't tell them that we were on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, which started at 12:30 a.m. I let them believe that we were on the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon that starts at 11:30 p.m. But, we're out, playing at Coachella, and we're opening for, Ockerville River for like a month on tour, who were like a really big deal for me in college. We're opening up for Bright Eyes, opening up for the Pogues, like doing all these things and playing to like big audiences like all over the world. And it was cool, like it's a topic for another podcast perhaps, but it didn't actually fix everything for me. If anything, it probably exacerbated some of my problems that, kind of came to a head and I had to deal with them in a way that wasn't like completely pleasant a couple years later. As far as like what I think about it now, like I don't really think about it unless somebody asks me about it, like you've done to have me on this nice podcast. I think of it as, one of my assets, in the sense of like an asset, like, the thing when you go to the bank and ask for a mortgage to buy a house or something, they ask you, like, what are your assets? And, my biggest asset is that I'm the guy that wrote The Monitor, the second Titus Andronicus album. That doesn't get you very far in any bank. But, it's the thing that enables me to, if I want to go out and do a concert, like, that's the biggest thing that's going to help me sell the ticket for it. Or to help me sell the t-shirt to the person once they bought the ticket and now they're in the building. And I also, I'm the steward of it as well. It's like, it's something that needs to be protected. It's like a plant that needs to be watered once in a while. So if somebody asks me, like, will you come on this podcast and talk about it? I'm willing to do that because, first of all, it's nice of you to think of me. And secondly, I want to keep the legacy, well nourished and nurtured. And when I look back on my life as an artist and I think about, like, what I really have that's of value, I have something that no one can buy. I look back on my life and my travels, and I know that in every city in America and in every tiny little small town that I've been to, a stranger has come up to me, like, damn near with tears in their eyes and, like, fallen into my arms and, like, just can't tell me fast or loudly enough, like, how important the music that I've produced has been to them and how it's, changed their lives for the better, saved their lives, some of them often say. And, that's priceless. So if the album has done anything for me, it's given me that.
Visit lifeoftherecord.com for more information about Titus Andronicus. You'll also find a full transcript of this episode and a link to purchase The Monitor. Instrumental music is the song The Anniversaries by the Tisburys. Thanks for listening.